Everyone laughed when 11-year-old Emily Carter loaded a pile of rusty, cracked irrigation pipes onto the back of her tiny wagon. "She's collecting junk," one farmer joked. "Maybe she thinks old pipes can grow corn." Even the auction worker shook his head as he handed her the last bundle for just a few dollars, convinced no sensible person would ever want equipment that had already been thrown away. Emily didn't argue. She simply smiled, thanked them, and hauled every broken pipe home. 3 months later, while the expensive irrigation systems across the valley struggled to keep dying fields alive during the worst drought in decades, one small farm stood out like a green island in a sea of brown. Cars lined the roadside. Farmers gathered at the fence, staring in disbelief at rows of healthy corn, tomatoes, and beans that seemed impossible under the scorching summer sun. The same people who had laughed now whispered the same question. How did that little girl do it? What none of them knew was that the answer had been buried beneath their feet for nearly 30 years, hidden inside a forgotten idea that everyone else had dismissed as worthless, just like the old irrigation pipes Emily had collected. The drought had settled over Millbrook Valley so slowly that no one noticed how desperate things had become until the fields stopped changing color by early July. The grass had faded from green to yellow. The ponds had shrunk into muddy circles, and every afternoon, a dry wind carried dust across the roads instead of the cool scent of fresh soil. For Margaret Carter, each sunrise brought the same quiet worry. She stood on the porch of the small farmhouse, looking across the few acres that had belonged to her family for generations. The rows of corn barely reached her knees. The tomato plants drooped despite careful watering, and the vegetable garden that usually helped pay the bills looked weaker every day. At 71, she had survived storms, floods, and harsh winters. But she had never seen the land thirst for so long. Emily Carter watched her grandmother from the porch steps, already knowing what the silence meant. Margaret rarely complained, but she had started studying unpaid bills every evening before quietly folding them away. The local farming supply store had offered a discount on a modern irrigation system, yet even with financing, it cost more money than they could ever afford. "If this keeps up," Margaret finally admitted one morning, "we may have to sell before harvest." Emily lowered her eyes. The farm was more than land. It was where her parents had grown up before the accident that left Margaret raising her alone. Losing it felt like losing the last piece of her family. Later that afternoon, Emily pulled her little red wagon toward the edge of town, behind the farming cooperative. Workers had piled old irrigation pipes that had been replaced by newer equipment. Most were scratched, faded, or cracked at the ends. She knelt beside them, turning one over in her hands as if searching for something everyone else had missed. "You actually want those?" An older farmer laughed. "They're worthless." Another man grinned. "Maybe she's building a playground." A few others joined the laughter as Emily calmly loaded the first pipe into her wagon. She didn't answer. She simply thanked the worker who told her she could take as many as she liked, because otherwise they were headed for the scrapyard. Trip after trip, she gathered more pieces until the wagon was nearly full. The rusty pipes rattled with every bump on the road as she pulled them back toward the farm. Margaret frowned when she saw the pile. "Emily, why bring all this junk home?" Emily brushed dirt from one of the pipes. "I don't think it's junk." Her grandmother sighed, but smiled softly anyway. "You've always seen things differently." That evening, while washing mud from the pipes with a garden hose, Emily noticed faint markings scratched near one connector. They weren't factory numbers. Someone had carefully carved a small symbol that looked like two crossed leaves inside a circle. She paused, tracing it with her fingertip. The symbol felt strangely familiar, though she couldn't remember where she had seen it before. Holding the pipe beneath the fading sunlight, Emily stared at the unusual mark, wondering who had carved it there years ago. The next morning, Emily carried the marked pipe to the old wash basin behind the farmhouse and carefully scrubbed away years of dirt with a stiff brush. As more rust came off, the carved symbol became clearer. Two crossed leaves rested inside a neat circle, followed by a tiny hand-cut letter N. She turned the pipe over several times, hoping to find another clue, but there was nothing else except worn metal and faded scratches from years of use. Margaret stepped outside carrying a basket of laundry and smiled at the sight of her granddaughter, still cleaning what everyone else considered trash. "You really believe those old things can help us?" she asked gently. Emily shrugged. "Maybe not by themselves, but someone cared enough to mark this one." Margaret looked closer, narrowing her eyes. "That symbol." She paused, trying to remember. "It reminds me of something your grandfather used to draw, though I'm not certain." Emily's heart lifted. Noah Carter had died before she was old enough to remember much about him, leaving behind only a few photographs, old tools, and stories about how much he loved the farm. If the symbol belonged to him, perhaps the pipe had a history worth understanding. After breakfast, Emily continued cleaning the remaining pipes and stacked them neatly beside the barn. Several were cracked, but most could still be connected if repaired. Around noon, she pulled her wagon into town to collect a few more discarded fittings. As she passed the general store, Ben Harris leaned against his pickup truck with two other farmers. He spotted the wagon immediately and laughed. "Still collecting junk, Emily." She smiled politely. "I'm almost done." Ben shook his head with an amused grin. "You'll spend more time fixing those pipes than they're worth." One of the men chuckled, but Emily simply kept walking. She had learned that arguing rarely changed anyone's mind. When she returned home, Margaret suggested looking through the attic. If that symbol really belonged to your grandfather, maybe he left something behind. The attic smelled of cedar wood and dust. Old trunks, broken chairs, and faded boxes filled the narrow space beneath the roof. Emily carefully searched shelf after shelf until she uncovered a weathered wooden chest tucked beneath an old quilt. Inside were family photographs, worn gardening gloves, several notebooks, and a leather-bound journal with Noah Carter's name written neatly inside the cover. Emily opened it with trembling hands. The first pages described weather patterns, planting seasons, and careful notes about soil. Near the middle, she stopped. A hand-drawn sketch filled both pages. It showed irrigation pipes connected across a hillside. Beside the drawing was the exact same symbol carved into the pipe resting downstairs. Two crossed leaves inside a circle. Emily stared at the page, hardly breathing. The old pipe she had rescued from the scrapyard was part of something her grandfather had once designed. She slowly turned another page, where a heading written in careful handwriting read, "Experimental Gravity Irrigation Layout." Emily read every page of the irrigation sketch twice before carrying the journal downstairs. The drawing looked simple at first, but the notes beside it explained how water could travel through connected pipes using only the natural slope of the land. Some sentences were faded, and a few measurements were difficult to read. Yet the overall idea was clear enough for her to understand. Noah Carter had believed a carefully planned system could water crops without expensive equipment. Emily laid the journal beside the old pipes stacked near the barn and began matching the sketch to the pieces she had collected. Several connectors fit together perfectly, while others were cracked beyond use. She wrapped leaking joints with rubber strips cut from an old bicycle tube and tightened them with wire. By lunchtime, her hands were dirty, her knees ached, and the first test ended in disappointment. Water sprayed through 3 leaks before reaching the garden, soaking the ground in all the wrong places. Emily sighed as the small flow stopped completely. Margaret watched from the porch, worried but gentle. "You've worked hard enough for today," she said. "Maybe your grandfather never had the chance to finish it because it simply couldn't work." Emily looked down at the journal. "Maybe he just needed more time." Margaret smiled sadly. "You sound just like him." Emily spent the afternoon studying the sketch again. One note mentioned keeping every section level before allowing the land itself to create pressure. She realized she had connected 2 pipes at the wrong angle. After moving several sections and digging a shallow trench across the edge of the vegetable patch, she tried again. This time the water traveled farther before another joint burst open. The leak was smaller, but it was still enough to stop the flow. As she searched for another way to seal it, a pickup truck slowed beside the road. Ben Harris climbed out, carrying a small toolbox from the truck bed. "Heard you've declared war on broken pipes," he said with a grin. Emily smiled without embarrassment. "They're winning." Ben knelt beside the leaking joint and examined it for a moment. "Wire's too loose." He pulled a metal clamp from the toolbox, tightened it around the connection, and handed the wrench to Emily. "Try now." She turned the valve again. Water pushed through the repaired joint without leaking, then continued into the next section before slowing to a steady trickle. Ben crossed his arms. "Didn't expect it to get that far." Emily thanked him quietly. "I thought you said these pipes were worthless." Ben shrugged. "Still might be. But I hate seeing someone quit before finding out." Together they checked each connection until the final length reached the small vegetable garden. Emily opened the valve one last time. A thin stream flowed through the entire line before dripping gently into the dry soil around the first row of tomatoes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to dampen the ground exactly where the plants needed it. Emily looked from the water to her grandfather's journal, hardly believing the first stage of the old design had finally come to life. Over the next 2 weeks, Emily followed her grandfather's notes as closely as she could. Every morning before the heat settled over the valley, she checked each connection, tightened loose clamps, and cleared dirt from the narrow channels that carried water toward the vegetable garden. The system was far from perfect. Small leaks still appeared now and then, and the flow slowed whenever a joint shifted. But each repair taught her something new. The journal rarely explained every step. Instead, Noah had filled the margins with short observations. "Watch the slope, not the pipe," and "the roots need steady water, not more water." Emily began to understand what he meant. Instead of flooding the soil all at once, the old pipes delivered a slow, steady supply that soaked deep into the ground, while neighboring gardens baked beneath the afternoon sun. The earth around Margaret's vegetables stayed cool beneath the surface. A week later, tiny green shoots appeared stronger than before. The tomato vines lifted their leaves instead of curling inward, and the bean plants began climbing their wooden stakes again. Margaret knelt beside the garden one morning, gently touching a healthy tomato blossom. "I haven't seen them look this strong in weeks," she whispered. Emily smiled, but kept studying the pipes. She wanted to be certain the improvement wasn't just luck. Across the road, Ben noticed the difference as well. He walked over after finishing his own chores and stood quietly beside the fence. "Those plants are looking better," he admitted. Emily nodded. "The water reaches the roots slowly." Ben glanced toward his own field, where patches of dry soil spread wider every day. "Maybe your grandfather knew something we've forgotten." Emily handed him the journal. Ben carefully flipped through the worn pages before stopping at the irrigation sketch. "He really planned all this himself." "I think so," Emily answered. "I'm just trying to follow what he started." Ben returned the journal with a thoughtful expression. "Keep going." Encouraged, Emily spent that evening reading more of Noah's notes by the kitchen window while Margaret prepared dinner. Most entries described weather records and planting schedules, but every few pages he returned to the irrigation project, making careful corrections in the margins. Then Emily reached a section near the back of the journal. Across the top of one page, Noah had written, "Stage 2 improves efficiency." Emily eagerly turned the page, expecting another diagram. Instead, she froze. The next sheet had been torn out completely. Only a rough strip remained near the binding, leaving no drawing, no instructions, and no explanation. She slowly flipped forward, hoping the missing page had been tucked elsewhere. But it was gone. Emily stared at the empty space where the next part of her grandfather's design should have been, realizing the answer she needed had once been there. Emily spent the next morning searching every corner of the attic, convinced the missing journal page had simply slipped between the boxes over the years. She opened old trunks, shook out folded blankets, and carefully examined every notebook that had belonged to her grandfather. By noon, the attic floor was covered with dusty keepsakes, but the missing page was nowhere to be found. She climbed down, disappointed, carrying only the journal. Margaret watched her from the kitchen table. "No luck." Emily slowly shook her head. "The most important part is gone." Margaret rested a gentle hand on the journal. "Your grandfather always kept copies of important things. If he tore that page out, he probably put it somewhere safe." The thought gave Emily a little hope. That afternoon, she walked into town to return a borrowed wrench to Ben Harris. He noticed the journal tucked under her arm. "Still studying your grandfather's drawings?" he asked. Emily nodded before explaining about the missing page. Ben thought quietly for a moment. "You know, years ago, when the community barn was cleaned out, I remember helping move a stack of old wooden boxes. One belonged to your grandfather." Emily looked up immediately. "Where did they go?" "Most were stored in the old supply room behind the community hall. Nobody's touched them in years." Ben offered to take her there. The small storage room smelled of dry wood and dust. Shelves were packed with forgotten tools, faded signs, broken buckets, and several unmarked crates. They spent nearly an hour opening boxes, one after another. Most contained rusty hardware or worn farm records. Just as Emily began losing hope, Ben pulled a narrow wooden box from the back of the highest shelf. Burned into the lid was the same symbol of two crossed leaves inside a circle. Emily carefully lifted the lid. Inside lay several rolled papers tied with faded string. She gently untied them and spread the largest sheet across an old workbench. It was not the missing journal page, but a detailed hand-drawn map of the Carter farm. Thin lines traced the hills, garden, well, and every irrigation pipe. One line, drawn in darker ink than the others, curved beneath the vegetable field before ending with a small handwritten note. Secondary supply line. Emily compared the map with the journal. The missing stage had depended on another pipe that wasn't shown anywhere else. Ben studied the drawing. "If this map is right, that line should still be under your field." Emily traced the route with her finger, realizing her grandfather had planned something far more complete than the simple system she had rebuilt. Somewhere beneath the dry soil, the final piece of his design had been waiting for years. Early the next morning, Emily carried the hand-drawn map into the field while Ben brought 2 shovels from his truck. Margaret watched from the porch, uncertain whether digging through one of the few healthy sections of the farm was a good idea. But she trusted her granddaughter enough not to stop her. Emily carefully measured the distance shown on Noah's map, counting her steps from the old well before pushing a wooden stake into the dry ground. "It should be here," she said quietly. They dug for nearly an hour beneath the hot summer sun. Dust filled every shovel load, and more than once Ben wondered if the map had been wrong. Then his shovel struck something solid with a dull metallic sound. Both of them froze. Emily dropped to her knees and brushed away the loose dirt with her hands until the curved surface of an old metal pipe appeared beneath the soil. It was weathered, but still intact. The same symbol of two crossed leaves had been carved into its side. "You found it," Ben whispered. Working carefully, they uncovered several more feet of the buried line before exposing a connection that matched the pipes Emily had already repaired. The missing section had never disappeared. It had simply remained hidden underground all those years. By late afternoon, they joined the old line to the existing system, replacing one damaged connector with a spare fitting from Emily's collection. Margaret opened the valve near the well while Emily watched every joint. Water flowed into the first pipe, then the second, disappearing beneath the ground through the newly uncovered line. For several nervous seconds, nothing happened. Then small streams began emerging from the outlets farther down the vegetable rows, each one releasing only a gentle trickle. The flow reached every section of the garden without flooding the soil. Emily checked the well's water level twice before looking back at the plants. The system was using noticeably less water than before, yet every row received an even supply. Noah's missing second stage had balanced the pressure exactly as the journal promised. During the following days, the difference became impossible to ignore. While neighboring farms watered heavily each morning, Margaret needed far less from the well to keep the vegetables healthy. The soil stayed damp beneath the surface long after the afternoon heat arrived. The tomatoes ripened faster, the bean vines climbed higher, and even the struggling corn looked stronger. Ben mentioned what he had seen during a visit to the feed store. Within days, several farmers slowed their trucks as they passed the Carter farm, staring at the unusually green rows. Quiet conversations spread through the valley. People who had laughed at Emily's wagon full of discarded pipes now wondered how such a small farm could be thriving during the worst drought anyone could remember. Before the week ended, word reached the town office, and Emily learned that Mayor Collins planned to visit the Carter farm himself because he refused to believe the stories were true. Mayor Collins arrived the next afternoon in a clean white truck, followed by several farmers who had heard enough rumors to want proof for themselves. Emily stood beside Margaret near the garden fence, holding Noah Carter's journal tightly against her chest. She had faced teasing before, but this felt different. Now the people who had laughed were waiting for her to explain something even adults did not fully understand. Mayor Collins stepped carefully between the rows, looking at the healthy tomato vines, the climbing beans, and the damp soil beneath the leaves. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I've been told this field is using less water than the others." Margaret nodded toward Emily. "You should ask my granddaughter. She built it." A few farmers shifted awkwardly. Emily felt her face grow warm, but Ben stood nearby and gave her a small, encouraging nod. She opened the journal to the first drawing and showed the mayor the copied layout beside the actual pipes. "My grandfather designed it," she said. "I only followed his notes and repaired the old parts." Mayor Collins frowned, not unkindly, but with clear doubt. "Old pipes don't make water appear." "No," Emily answered. "They just stop wasting it." She led him to the valve near the well and asked Margaret to open it halfway. Water moved quietly through the repaired line, not spraying high or flooding the rows, but slipping into each section with slow, even pressure. Emily pointed to the shallow channels, then to the buried secondary line they had uncovered. The slope carries it. The hidden pipe balances it. The roots get water slowly so the ground stays damp longer. Ben stepped forward. I saw her dig that old line up. It was exactly where Noah's map said it would be. One farmer knelt and pushed his fingers into the soil near a tomato plant. His expression changed when he felt the moisture below the dry surface. Another farmer checked farther down the row and found the same thing. The quiet that followed was not laughter. It was the silence of people realizing they had been wrong. Mayor Collins examined the journal again, then the map from the community hall. Noah Carter drew all of this. Emily nodded. Years ago. Ben removed his hat and looked at her with visible shame. Emily, I owe you an apology. I laughed when you collected those pipes. I thought you were wasting your time. Emily looked at him, surprised by how much the words meant. It's okay. No, Ben said gently. It wasn't. You saw value where the rest of us saw junk. Margaret's eyes shone with quiet pride. For the first time in weeks, she looked less tired. As Mayor Collins turned another folded paper from the wooden box, a yellowed document slipped loose and landed against the journal. Across the top, in faded ink, were the words, Proposal Rejected. The yellowed document had been folded so many times that its edges were beginning to crumble. Mayor Collins opened it carefully while the small group gathered around. Beneath the words, Proposal Rejected, was Noah Carter's name and a date from nearly 30 years earlier. Emily watched quietly as the mayor read the short report aloud. Noah had submitted a plan showing how old irrigation pipes could be reused to create a gravity-fed watering system that required far less water than the expensive equipment available at the time. The proposal praised the idea for its simplicity, but concluded that the town would continue supporting newer commercial systems instead. There was no accusation, no hidden conspiracy, only a decision that had slowly buried a practical solution beneath changing times. Margaret lowered her eyes. He came home disappointed that day, she said softly. But he never complained. He just kept working the farm. Emily looked at the worn journal in her hands and imagined her grandfather drawing maps late into the night, hoping someone might one day finish what he had started. Ben broke the silence first. Looks like he was right after all. Several farmers nodded. One admitted he had already lost part of his vegetable crop, despite using twice as much water as the Carters. Another asked Emily if she would show him how the old pipes were connected. She smiled and agreed. During the following weeks, neighbors began collecting discarded irrigation pipes instead of sending them to the scrapyard. Ben helped organize weekend workdays, and Emily used Noah's journal and the recovered map to explain the layout of the system. Every farm was different, but the same ideas worked again and again. Use the land's natural slope, repair instead of replace, and deliver water slowly where the roots needed it most. Before long, more patches of green appeared across the valley. The drought had not ended, yet the farms wasted far less water than before. At the town's annual harvest gathering, Mayor Collins invited Margaret and Emily onto the small wooden stage in front of their neighbors. He presented Noah Carter's journal beside a new plaque honoring his contribution to the community. Some ideas arrive before people are ready to appreciate them, he said. Today we recognize a farmer whose work is helping this town many years after he first imagined it. Margaret quietly wiped away a tear while Emily looked at the familiar symbol of two crossed leaves engraved onto the plaque. It no longer represented a forgotten sketch hidden in an attic or an old pipe buried beneath dry soil. It had become a reminder that good ideas never truly disappear if someone is willing to believe in them. As the sun began to set over Millbrook Valley, Emily stood beside the thriving fields with her grandmother. The same neighbors who had once laughed at her little red wagon were now using old irrigation pipes on their own farms. The Carter farm would not have to be sold. Noah Carter's work had finally been recognized, and Emily had discovered that the greatest inheritance her grandfather left behind was never the land itself. It was the courage to see value where everyone else saw only something ready to be thrown away.